Hello, my dear friends. How are you? Welcome. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Mario Thurger, and today I would like to talk about Diana, in terms of this goddess association with the sacred feminine and the figure of the wild woman. I've already addressed this goddess in this channel in a past video. That's Soul, that's my cat. Well, particularly in a past video, as I was saying, concerning the depiction of this goddess as the goddess of witches in the 10th century, an association constructed by the Catholic Church which changed the view on this goddess and since has become an icon of womanhood. The sacred feminine, and the very archetype of the wild woman, as well as of the witch figure, right? But today I would like to talk a little bit more about these subjects, especially concerning this idea of the sacred feminine. So much expressed in the figure of this goddess. The sacred feminine is a concept that addresses the veneration of the feminine in its various expressions, found in many religious traditions from various aspects of the same feminine divinity to the worship of female figures who are worshipped for qualities associated with transcendental wisdom and longevity, as we see in, for instance, as an example, Buddhism. In some esoteric Buddhist schools, we also see an emphasis on the veneration of the feminine, even being central to both practices and rituals. And then we have the archetype of the wild woman, which in psychology can be seen as a personification of the collective unconscious. But here we are more focused on the concepts created, or the concepts of Carl Jung's psychology. Here the wild woman is an archetype of archaic and ancestral wisdom, which can act as a guide that helps women get in touch with their deepest emotions, desires, and needs, promoting a sense of integration and completeness. This archetype was popularized by Clarissa Pinkola Estes in her book Women Who Run with Wolves, Myths and Stories of the Wild Woman Archetype, precisely, which I know many of you have a lot of negative criticism to make about this book, but nevertheless, when I read it many years ago, I really liked the book. But then, well, through this author I have mentioned, we see the popularization of this archetype that embodies the innate and intuitive side of women, symbolizing the primal wisdom that was, well, erased in Western society, marked by the monotheism of a male god. Of course, also taking into account that the goddess Diana, as a figure who rescues the sacred feminine and independence in a society marked by the inequality and domination, right? Thus becoming popular in Leland's work, Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches, which I've already mentioned here sometimes before in other videos, and we shall get to that further ahead. And it is a work that will greatly influence the first wave of feminism, especially in the romanticization of the figure of the witch as this new icon of egalitarianism and suffrage. We then have all these works and concepts from feminism, literary romanticism, Carl Jung's psychology, the popularization of the wild woman archetype, and the westernization of Oriental spirituality precisely at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, where all these strands will come together and later, much later, culminate in the second half of the 20th century. And so there is yet another new interpretation and reinvention of the figure of Diana as the goddess of the sacred feminine. Therefore, I would like to talk a little bit about this, right? This video is also dedicated to someone who has not yet been born into this world, but when the time comes, that person shall have this video as part of my legacy, as guidance in the darkest roads of life. Without further delay, let's begin, my dear friends, if you please. So I don't want to repeat what was already said about Diana in an older video I made, which I've already mentioned here, right? And you can see in the description of this video. And the reinterpretation of this goddess by the church that ended up turning this goddess into the goddess of witches, which later led Leland to create a work of fiction, since several studies have already been conducted, and what Leland wrote about Diana and her daughter Herodias is not actually any ancient tradition that survived the church, but rather his own fiction and reinterpretation of Diana, Herodias, and the figure of the witch. But nevertheless, this work was fundamental in opening the doors to new studies on witchcraft. Witchcraft and the divine feminine as well, which then through the first wave of feminism and through the author and historian Margaret Murray, we have for the first time the first feminist interpretation of witchcraft and on the figure of the witch, which in turn would influence the Western perception of the feminine, the divine feminine and the sacred feminine through Wicca, the most famous and most widespread New Age neo-pagan religious movement. All of these themes, all of these subjects have already been discussed here before, previously in several videos, and you, as I said, you can check them at the description of this video down below. But, well, it is important to remember how the reinterpretation of the goddess Diana and her association with the feminine, and in particular with witches, will give rise to a chain of events that during the Romantic movement of the 19th century and the feminist movement of the 20th century will make this goddess central to the Western understanding of the sacred feminine, and also the figure of the witch itself then becomes the icon, even the mascot of the feminist movement, at least the first wave of the feminist movement, and second wave actually in the 1960s. Anyway, therefore I would like to begin this topic today by briefly addressing the perception of femininity in Christian and pagan ethics. Well, let me remind you that ethics, broadly speaking, of course, is the set of moral principles and values that guide human behavior in the various spheres of life. It is important to remember that religion plays a prominent role in social organization, which is why we must analyze the discourses of the various religions that influence us, especially those that are most prominent in the society in which we live, because by analyzing these discourses, we can see the dynamics of power. Religion is, without a doubt, a political tool, which is why it imposes its ethics on the individual and on the collective. As I said, religion is used in social organization precisely by imposing the ethics that the society in which any given religion is inserted believes to be the fundamental moral principles and values for organizing and controlling the population. From here, we observe the distinction between genders in the Christian myth of the creation of man. Man, the masculine, is created from clay. He had no suitable helper. This is what we read in Genesis, in the scriptures. And also that woman, his extension of man, of the male, has a determined existence. She's created to help man. Right? Christian ethics defines a hierarchy among living beings and standardizes expected behaviors of what it calls man and woman. The Christian myths of creation already define the behavior and purpose of the existence of women. The main focus is the masculine, and the woman in her purpose is created to help the main element, the masculine. This is what comes in the scriptures, right? This is then, of course, what we will see consecutively in Western society, dominated by Christianity to this day, which, as I said before, religion imposes its ethics, moral values, and principles. Therefore, imposing such a fixed perception of genders and even the purpose of its existences, thus organizing society in a way that will defend the patriarchy and always understanding women as a figure of servitude to the masculine. In fact, our society is dominated by these religious thoughts, will give us a very fixed perception of what a woman is, in the sense that no one is born a woman, but rather a person becomes a woman. It is society itself that determines what a woman is. It is society itself dominated by religious ethics that determines what is feminine and what should be feminine, completely diverting the focus from the nature of the human being. Society is dominated by these religious thoughts, will expect women to submit to their predetermined function before any woman is even born. And the scriptures say, and I quote Ephesians, or whatever, however the fuck you pronounce this, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands." So we see then this submission of the woman to the masculine, and every behavior and feeling that does not fit into this is then repudiated or nullified. This, of course, results in internal conflicts and personal dissatisfaction, leading to the nullification of the woman's identity and also of the man's, because a society controlled by the ethics of religion will be stuck to these understandings because they are seen not only as the truth, but as the correct way to act and live and exist. Now, contrary to Christian doctrine, many occult and pagan traditions value femininity as a powerful and creative force. In many societies and cultures and even religions, women are often seen as equally sacred, even glorified as priestesses, celebrating feminine divinity and connection to nature. Of course, obviously, in many occult societies and pagan religions and belief systems of the past and modern times, mostly modern times, the focus on the feminine is not always an actual valorization of the feminine, but rather in itself also a patriarchal control of the feminine, determining the place and purpose of women in religion and society itself. This is often what is difficult to understand in our Western societies, or societies, of course, that have been governed by patriarchal religions or belief systems. Because the feminine has been devalued and even nullified for so many centuries, when a religion or group gives space to the feminine, it immediately seems that it is giving great value to the feminine and giving freedom to women, when in fact it is only determining the value and function of women and the feminine, thus continuing to control and impose behavior, but in a different way, more often than not, in a very esoteric way, which is quite appealing to those who want spirituality as an escapism. Especially in Western society and in occult and pagan circles, many people are deceived into thinking that certain groups, movements, and religions are giving freedom to women because the bar is so low, and we are already accustomed to expecting submission from women, So when something expresses a little more about the feminine, we fall into the error of thinking that it is giving great value and putting women on an equal footing with men. That's why I say, as I said in a previous video, we need to change our perception of what we really think to be feminine and masculine, or man and woman, because many times these are not only concepts created by society, but also what we determine to be real and right through religious ethics and the total abandonment of the understanding of what is feminine and masculine, this division, this understanding of opposites. It is essential to forget this and see the world, others, and ourselves as persons of this world, embracing otherness. Much of what we think to be feminine and masculine is not real. It is not natural. They are just social and religious concepts so deeply rooted in the collective consciousness that we think we know what a woman and a man are, and we have this so determined, so fixed, that many times we are not even capable of understanding discourses that really serve to free us from these prisons that force us to act and exist in a limited way that is neither natural nor allows us to truly express our potential as living beings. But then it is interesting to see that deities that represent the darkest aspects of femininity or that threaten the social order are taboo, considered demons even, in the pejorative sense of the word. However, by studying such deities, and their cults, of course, we see that they highlight profound and transformative aspects of the feminine experience. Or in other words, they present the condition and experience of one of the multiple facets of human beings, highlighting a transcendence of the conventional categories of good and evil. We can call this the Via Sinistrae, which I've already talked about many years ago on this channel when I still had hair. Via Sinistrae, in other words, the left path, like the study of the dark side, right? Here I've already explained why this connotation in that old video. It is the breaking of social taboos, practices of sexual magic, black magic, curses, etc., etc., a set of subjects that are normally seen as taboo, but are addressed in these paths of study and practice as a complement to the human condition and cannot be denied because they are part of the experience of life and existence. This is then, as I said, reflected in some deities, some gods and goddesses. Since we are talking about the feminine, I will mention some goddesses in a moment and other entities seen as feminine, very briefly. But there are also, of course, gods and other entities seen as masculine, but, well, that is not the focus now. In fact, there are deities and other entities that, although many of us determine gender due to our limited perception and understanding of the human condition and nature determined by religion and what is ethically valid and correct by the society in which we live, such entities do not have gender and perfectly express the human condition and experience without gender limitations, but still, due to such limitations, we forcibly attribute gender and then determine behavior linked to gender due to our own invention of gender about the divine, consequently determining the very condition, behavior, value, and experience of the divine itself. Moving on. This is where the Via Sinistrae comes into play in occultism, which then, as I was saying, refers to a spiritual approach that focuses on exploring the darkest and most taboo aspects of human existence and experience. It is a path that seeks to break with conventional social and cultural norms, exploring themes such as death, chaos, transgression, and the liberation of moral restrictions. So one of the entities that reflects what I was saying is Lilith, the Judeo-Christian mythology, right? Adam's first wife, created at the same time and in the same way as him, rebellious and independent. She defied male authority by refusing to submit to Adam. In Judaism, she is associated with demons and is considered a nocturnal and dangerous creature. Here we see an interesting facet of an animist belief system that ended up being subjugated by religions that focus on patriarchal power. We also have Hecate, Greek Hellenic mythology, right? A pre-Olympian goddess, therefore, before the late conception of the pantheon and the patriarchal control over religion, a goddess associated with magic, crossings of paths, night and death, among many other things normally considered taboo. Her dominion over the world of darkness and her role as a guardian of the portals made her a fearsome figure, especially for those who feared the unknown and the supernatural. Another example is Persephone. Persephonis. We continue with Hellenism, queen of the underworld, associated with death and renewal. Her annual journey to the underworld, where she spends part of the year as the wife of Hades, represents also the transition between the seasons and the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. An essential understanding of the impact of the natural cycles of the world on human condition. Inanna or Ista, Mesopotamian deity, goddess of fertility, love, war, and desire. Its multifaceted nature reflects both the duality of life and the complexity of human beings. Trobaruna, Lusitanian mythology, the goddess of the home, battles, death, family, and magic, representing the dynamics of the human community in the various facets and struggles of life, the individual impact on the collective and the impact of the collective on the individual, perpetuating a cycle of changes that affect the whole. Freya, Norse mythology, goddess associated with love, beauty, fertility, sex, war, wealth, and prophetic magic. Not so different from Trobaruna, honestly, showing the potential of women over the various spheres of human life and human experience, not succumbing to the stereotype of just an association with love, motherhood, and a caring figure, but a goddess both worshipped and feared, representing the harsh reality of survival in human society, transcending and becoming a beacon of dynamism. Many religions, including pagan ones, in one way or another, depending on the ethics they want to impose on their societies, have been, let's say, profaned. Some aspects of human experience become sacrilegious, right? Blasphemous. There's even imposing gender behavior to go against imposing gender behavior that go against the expressions that become sacrilegious. But there is no doubt that religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and later Islam have always had in their forefront a desire to profane the feminine, or at least to profane certain aspects of women's lives' expressions. The idea of a single, all-powerful and good masculine god is quite common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The characteristics of the divinity expose a power relationship in social organization. In all religions, the divine expression that is considered to be in control, or the maximum force of creation and in turn of order and laws, will also be the model of what should be implemented in a society according to the divine order. This is because religious notions of the divine will in turn monopolize the sacred. So, as in these religious examples that I gave here, the masculine monopolizes the sacred, the feminine is desacralized, right? That is, robbed of its sacredness and role in religion, therefore becoming profane and often impure. The natural cycle of fertility, for example, is seen as something shameful and dirty. I think that here, with this example, one can better understand why there is so much taboo around sexuality in these religions that I've mentioned here. Through notions of what is considered to be masculine, namely violence being a characteristic that is applied to the masculine by certain religions, the maintenance of masculine power occurs, right? Both in reality and symbolically. It is no coincidence that certain religions in which the divine is masculine have such a violent history, because the divine masculine itself, in this case in relation to the single divinity of the religions mentioned here before, is also a violent god, and this characteristic will be implemented in the society that is governed by the religion of this violent god. As such, the sacred feminine for these religions, in which the feminine is seen as weak, but also soft and fragile, will be a constant threat to the divine masculine violent order itself. This is why many people blame masculinity, but the problem is much deeper than that. The problem is not masculinity. The problem is not only the notions of what masculine should and have to be, but also placing one gender in a position of privileged power in relation to all other genders and sexual orientations. The problem is not the masculine. The problem is the patriarchy. That is, the problem is limiting and fixing the characteristics and behaviors of a gender and forcing that gender to behave according to what has been stipulated and accepted, and placing that same gender with power and privilege over all others who do not fit in and have been alienated with the characteristics and behaviors that religion imposes on society. For this very reason, everything that is considered feminine is profaned. Hence, in religious terms, any goddess who challenges the social order of power is demonized and destroyed. As in many pre-Christian religions, the feminine is also part of the forces of creation, or is the primitive, primeval element of creation. Patriarchal religions will then demonize these belief systems. The point here is that the more animist these belief systems are, the more they remain in popular memory. Now, considering that traditional folk magic, in other words, witchcraft, is a practical expression of animist beliefs, many religious elements will remain and fit into the practice, and for this very reason, some goddesses also end up remaining in popular memory and are evoked and even invoked in popular magic practices. This is what happened with the goddess Diana. Now, leaving aside Leland's inventions mentioned here previously, Diana really remained in popular memory, mainly among the people who were once incorporated into the Roman Empire, but also other peoples and cultures that ended up adopting Diana in their practices and belief systems, just as they would later adopt Jesus and whichever deity they would come in contact with and saw fitting to include in their beliefs. Diana, Diana is the Roman goddess of wild animals and hunting. Her name is related to the Latin words theos, in the sense of divine, heavenly, and dies, day, with Latin authors describing her not only as the illumination of the moon, but also as Diana Lucifera, Diana light bearer. It is not yet known for sure, but there is indeed a possibility that Diana was an ancient Etruscan deity of the forest. In any case, Diana was quickly associated with Artemis and other similar deities. There was probably no initial connection, no original connection between Diana and the moon, but she later absorbed Artemis's association with Selene, Luna, and Hecate, a chthonic goddess, infernal underworld goddess, right? Diana gained great popularity and ended up absorbing many characteristics of different goddesses, and for this reason she ended up remaining in the memory and popular imagination. So much so that, for example, in my country, as you know, Portugal, the Romans left a remarkable mark on culture and history, and many of the Roman temples that can still be seen and visited today were temples of the imperial cult. In other words, temples dedicated to the cult of the emperor, to the patriarchal cult, to the patriarchal order. But nevertheless, in folklore and popular wisdom and imagination in Portugal, we still call these temples temples of Diana, when they were never dedicated to Diana. So Diana actually became a very popular goddess in traditional witchcraft. So it is not strange that, as was said in that video I mentioned earlier about Diana, that in the 10th century, the church found a scapegoat in the figure of Diana as the goddess of witches. Diana, through the church, the Catholic Church, became the entity that guides and initiates witches, the goddess of witches, even before the figure of the devil became the scapegoat of the Catholic Church. With this demonization of Diana, in turn, her popularity continued among popular magical practices, but much later, because what the 10th century church commented on Diana and her connection with witchcraft, which later ended up also remaining in the imagination and popular magical practices, later on, leading authors like Leland in 1899 to publish his fiction, Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches, where Diana appears and plays an important role in this work. One way or another, Diana becomes popular once again and remains as a new icon of empowerment and the rescue of the feminine after European societies had been under the shadow of religious patriarchy for centuries. Diana is rescued and used as an icon of the first wave of feminism and literary romanticism that will give rise to new religious currents, New Age, neo-pagan, and occult circles. The book Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches, by Charles Godfrey Leland, already mentioned here a few times in some videos and in this video, this very video, despite being the author's own interpretation of Diana, Aradia, and what he believed to be a pagan tradition that survived Christianity, and being largely a work of fiction and very much a political expression, what we can call the fantastic scholarship, right, in the sense of transforming pieces of real information and historical evidences to create an alternative reality of history. Despite all of this, it is a work that resignifies the goddess Diana and thus opens the doors for this goddess to become a new icon, not only in the feminist movement, but also an icon of women's empowerment and a rescue of the feminine. Therefore, In 1899, folklorist Charles Godfrey Leland then publishes Aradia, or the Gospel of the Witches, presenting a new interpretation of the myth of Diana, a primordial goddess with light and darkness, a source of archaic and ancestral wisdom. In archetypal psychology, she would be the wild woman, a guide who encourages the recovery of intuitive knowledge that goes beyond the rational, the connection with nature, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Leland, in his work, claims to have found followers of a secret religion known as La Vecchia Religione, the ancient or old religion, an ancestral cult that survived among peasants, hidden from Italian Catholic society. His work would then, supposedly, according to the author, according to Leland, be the reproduction of the sacred texts on how to worship Diana and Aradia, an authentic book of magic. According to the book, Diana and Lucifer have a daughter named Aradia, perhaps a version of Herodias, who I also mentioned here before in a previous video, in a post-old video. Diana sends Aradia to Earth with the mission of teaching witchcraft to the poor and oppressed, so that they can use these powers against their masters and free themselves from oppression. Aradia must instruct the peasants to resist the impositions of the new religion, Christianity, and to fight for the preservation of their rights to economic and religious freedom. This book today is fundamentally for students of witchcraft, not for a reliable or as a reliable historical study of witchcraft, but for practical terms to apply new conceptions of this goddess and witchcraft, right? We have known for many years that this is a work of fiction. The Italian people's traditional beliefs and cultures and popular beliefs themselves have been well studied, and nothing that Leland says here really corresponds with reality, even by the words of practitioners of witchcraft in Italy, and even by practitioners of popular magic in Italy, right? We know that Leland's work aimed to express a clear political ideology, which in turn was well integrated into the first wave of feminism, and which gave rise to the resignification and transformation of the figure of the witch, now as a revolutionary, egalitarian, subversive figure of female empowerment, with Diana gaining a new cult, even leading to the construction of the new religion of Dianism and Dianic Wicca, also known as Dianic witchcraft, a modern pagan goddess tradition focused on female experience and empowerment. Diana also began to be included in other branches of New Age religions and in neo-paganisms, bringing back the cult of Diana in a modern form, of course, and with ancient characteristics, but also mainly different and new characteristics and attributes. I mean, just as in ancient Rome, Diana was progressively growing and becoming more popular and absorbing attributes and characteristics of other deities throughout the empire and other lands and beyond, and cultures and belief systems, other cultures and belief systems. The same thing happened in the Middle Ages, and again in contemporary times, with the cult of Diana having changed considerably for over more or less 2,500 years. But the cult of Diana, in one way or another and in many different forms, is still practiced today. So, my dear friends, I do hope you have enjoyed this video. May it be useful. Thank you so much for watching and for listening. Thank you for your time. Thank you for today. Until we meet again, my dear friends.